Okay, it's 10:03, so we will start and we will begin. Again, good morning, good afternoon in some places to everybody. Thank you very much for your interest. I remind you, we are at the cycle of conferences of the Center for Chinese-Mexican Studies of the School of Economics of UNAM. This is part of the effort we're doing together, Yolanda Trápaga Delfín and myself. And I invite you very much to look at the conferences that we usually do every 2 weeks, sometimes every week, since 2005. No? So we have an interesting group of videos, PowerPoints, audios on a wide variety of topics and issues. I do also invite you to our next conference that will be in 1 week, no? Which will be on trade policies by China under the analysis of the World Trade Organization. And we will have Willy Alfaro, who is in charge, the director of the Division of Trade Policies of the World Trade Organization. I think this is going to be an interesting conference for many of us. No? Today, I am very happy to introduce you to Dr. Isabella Webber. Isabella is a political economist working on China, trade and development issues, and also on the history of economic thought. She's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Massachusets in Amherst, and some of us have read her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate, which won the Joan Robinson Prize in 2021. No? And so we are very happy to, listen to some of the opinions, analysis on this topic by Isabella. No? You are very welcome, Isabella. And as I mentioned to you, we usually have presentations of around 30 to 45 minutes and similar time for questions by the chat of Zoom. No? So again, good morning, and I'm very happy that we could meet. No?
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to share some thoughts on my book with you in these extraordinary times. It's actually my first time that I have a chance to present this work in Mexico. I before presented in Brazil and Colombia and so on, but it's the first time in Mexico, so I'm very excited and hope there will be a chance to discuss in the Q&A. So let me try to share my screen, and I hope it all works. Can you see my screen now? Yes.
Perfectly,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. As Enrique has already said, the title of my book is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. This book is based on my dissertation. And when I started working on this topic already several years ago, there was no way for me to know how timely this question would become in the context of the world events in 2021 and 2022. In particular, in the context of the regulatory shift in China last year and the context of the dramatic events that are unfolding in front of our eyes. So in that sense, the book has been, in some sense, unfortunately, been very timely. I still hope that it can help us shed some light in terms of providing some historical context to the kind of juncture that we are at the moment. The book is really a book about the 1980s. I'm thinking and conceptualizing the 1980s as a crossroads in the global economy. From China's perspective, it's the beginning of China's economic convergence with the West. That is to say, China's weight in the global economy has increased in ways that has brought it closer towards the major Western economic powers. But this convergence in economic weight has not come along with a wholesale institutional assimilation of the Chinese economy and political system with those in Europe and the United States. Even though China has deeply marketized and has been deeply integrated into global capitalism. And I think to understand this tension between this economic convergence without wholesale institutional assimilation, it is worth going back to the first decade of reform in China and understand what kind of path of reform China has embarked on. The 1980s also mark a great divergence between what came to be called Russia's fall and China's rise, which of course cannot be reduced to a simple policy choice in reform policy making, but nevertheless it is linked to the difference in market reform approaches in the two countries. Just to give you a very simple estimate to illustrate what I mean by crossroads of the 1980s, if we use medicine GDP data and we go back to the early 19th century, then for China, this is basically a picture of fall and then re-emergence starting in the 1980s. Whereas in contrast for the USSR, it's a picture of rise and then fall, where the turning point is really the 1980s. This experience contrasts sharply with the experience of the United States, where this same period basically came along with a rapid rise and then some sort of a stagnation or slight decline in importance in the world economy. If we look at the transition in the two former giants of socialism from the perspective of two basic macroeconomic indicators, that is CPI and real GDP, we see in the case of Russia a picture of hyperinflation and GDP collapse. In fact, the GDP collapse came along with one of probably the most dramatic periods of deindustrialization in recent history, along with a pretty severe crisis in mortality, public health, education, and so on. In contrast, in China, the pace of growth in the CPI has almost consistently been outpaced by the growth in real GDP, with the exception of the late 1990s. So that in contrast to Russia, we have an image of relative price stability under conditions of very fast growth. Of course, in China, inequality has been rising very fast, and problems of environmental degradation and social justice and so on have been on the minds of scholars of China's development for years. If we compare the evolution of inequality in China and Russia, we can see that in Russia, inequality have increased in the context of an overall decline in incomes and then re-emergence in levels of income, whereas in China, it's basically the rich pulling ahead of the poor. The reform approach in Russia has been generally labeled as that of shock therapy. And of course, there's debate of who exactly were the architects of shock therapy and so on. And I don't want to go into the details here. I just want to characterize this basic approach to thinking about the transition from a planned to a market economy by summarizing what has been commonly acknowledged as being the four major ingredients of this approach. That is the liberalization of oil prices combined with macroeconomic austerity, where macroeconomic austerity is meant to control the general price level. And these two elements taken together is what came to be known the Big Bang. This was then meant to be complemented with trade liberalization in order to integrate the economy into the global market, and finally privatization. But even the most dedicated shock therapists acknowledged that privatization was a relatively slow, complicated process of institutional rebuilding, so that the shocking element in shock therapy really was the Big Bang. And the basic logic was that shocking the system from an old to a new system would require starting with such a Big Bang. From the perspective of neoclassical economics, this is in some sense emphasizing that one first has to get the prices right, otherwise there's no hope of having a market economy. There is a rich literature on the path that China has taken. There's a rich literature on the economic policies that have been implemented in China. but there has been relatively less attention paid to the economics of China's reform approach, that is, the intellectual underpinnings that inform the ways in which China has been going about its reform approach. This reform approach, I've been calling in my book, and others have been using similar language, gradualist experimentalism, that is the idea of feeling the way forward, which is not only about pace, but also different logic of reform, as I will elaborate throughout this talk. My book basically has two parts. The first part is a kind of exercise in zooming out and asking what different kinds of modes of market creation and price regulation were invoked in the context of China's 1980s market reform debate and were part of the large tapestry of knowledge and institutional legacies that informed market creation in China. I start with a chapter on the ancient tradition of statecraft going back to the Guanzi, that is 300 BC, where the idea is to illustrate that marketization in China was not simply the same as westernization, but that China had its own very long legacy of market creation through the state and market participation in the name of price stabilization. Some of the principles that I'm developing there are that economic and social stabilization can be achieved through market participation by the state, where the idea is that the state should be focusing on what is heavy to shoot at what is light, which is to say, should focus on the essential parts of the economic system, while governing the non-essential parts by stabilizing the essential parts. What is essential in this context changes over time, but in the imperial context, or even more so in ancient times, this was really about metals, salt, grain, and some other basic commodities. The question of grain is probably the most canonical example in this context, since the so-called ever normal granary persisted over centuries. It was an institution that was run based on the principle of participation by the state in the market, where the state would basically run public granaries that would buy grain in fall when the supply was very high and the prices were collapsing, and would then supply grain in spring and summer when supply was short and prices were high, thus basically aiming to stabilize prices through market participation. Of course, there were all sorts of crises and repeated debates and so on, and I'm not suggesting that this was all the same over thousands of years, but just as a basic logic, I think this is an important reference point. But the idea of my book is not to say, oh, we can explain China in the 1980s simply by always having been China, by some sort of an essentialist notion of what China has always been. Therefore, I'm also engaging in detail with the debates over price control during the Second World War in the United States, which allegedly is the freest market economy in the world. And in particular, also the question of price decontrol after the war, since the transition from a planned war economy to a post-war market economy was an important reference point in the debates over market reforms in the socialist world, since in many ways this had been the last incidence of such a transition from a planned to a market economy that people who were thinking about these issues in the 80s could draw on. As you can see in this graph, in the Second World War, prices were actually surprisingly stable compared to the First World War in the United States, and production was surprisingly strong, again, compared to the First World War. And this came along with a very comprehensive and far-ranging price control regime. After the war, these price controls were lifted more or less overnight, basically as a result of a political meltdown that resulted in a discontinuation of these price controls, which then gave rise to a very sharp increase in inflation. And as you can see here, this graph starting in 1946 in the context of decontrol. So in that sense, this sharp inflation after the war, in some sense, was a form of a small bang in the sense of very sudden liberalization. But of course, China also had its own experiences during wartime. And in fact, these experiences were incredibly important for the debates in the 1980s. If anything, I think they would have been the most important reference point for the question of how to recreate markets in China's command economy. As you all know, there was a long-ranging civil war in China. And one interpretation is that the communists basically won that war, not least because they were very successful at economic warfare. That is to say that they reintegrated the commercial links between the countryside and urban centers in their liberated areas and ensured that the currencies that they were issuing had something important to buy, stuff like cloth, textiles, and then in return in the cities, food, grain, and so on. In fact, I made this connection thanks to a note by a World Bank official in minutes on meetings with Chinese counterparts in 1982, where this World Bank official noted, why do the Chinese answer to every question that we have to go back to the liberation period policies? And these liberation period policies followed a similar kind of logic of state market participation as the one that I have tried to illustrate based on the idea of the ever-normal granary. In fact, probably the most famous slogan on China's reforms, "It is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily," has been invoked by one of the key architects of China's early economic reforms, Chen Yun, in April 1950, that is pretty shortly after the revolution, when the new communist government was struggling with the question of how to continue the effort at stabilizing prices, moving out of the hyperinflation during the Civil War. So the complete quote here then is, rising prices are not good, falling prices too are not good for production. And within the consciousness of China's leaders, their success in bringing hyperinflation under control, which the nationalists had failed to do, has been seen as a key element in the initial success of the communists, and thus has been considered an important part of the legitimacy of their government. So it's been politically something that carries a lot of meaning. Okay, moving fast forward to the 1970s and moving into the second part of my book, which kind of moves from these like big picture reference points to the debate in the 1980s, into this very close reading of the market reform debate, in particular the debate over the questions of price liberalization. I think it's important to acknowledge that the urge for reform in the late 70s was very great indeed. I'm not saying it was universal, but in the many interviews that I have conducted, which of course is a biased sample since I was interviewing reformers, since I was interested in the debates amongst reformers, but across these different kind of economic reformers who violently disagreed on the question of how to reform, there was pretty widespread agreement that in the late 1970s, reform was pretty much a choice of no choice, since the Cultural Revolution had long run out of steam. The attempts of Hua Guofeng to initiate another 10-year plan to push ahead with industrialization had very quickly run into a crisis when the projected oil findings that were meant to finance that big push did not come forward. So that in the late 1970s, China was really in search for a new kind of economic model. In this context, very early on, there was an acknowledgement that this new economic model would require China to revive markets in a more systematic way. In fact, already in 1979, Deng Xiaoping told a foreign journalist, quote, saying that the market is limited to capitalism is wrong. Why can't socialism practice market economics? But the question that was fiercely debated amongst reform economists was how to introduce market mechanisms into a command economy. On the surface, this might sound like a technical quibble among technocratic economists, but as I argue in the book, the how question of market recreation, I think, turned out to be quite consequential for China's subsequent path. Very broadly speaking, there were two camps of reformers. In the book, I'm distinguishing more, and I'm engaging with a whole range of individuals in quite some detail, but for the purposes of this short presentation, I'd like to just focus on two broad groups. On the one hand, there were the dual-track market reformers, who broadly speaking were composed of young reform intellectuals who had returned from the countryside after having spent their youth there during the Cultural Revolution as so-called sent down youth. They were backed by an older generation of leaders, such as, for example, Du Rongsheng, whom you can see here in this picture. And they really emerged as an important force in economic reform policy making as a result of their engagement with the agricultural reforms. The agricultural reforms started more or less as a bottom-up initiative, but in order for these bottom-up initiatives to be turned into national policy, a lot of systematic research was being conducted on the ground to understand how these experiments were playing out. And in this context, the so-called Nongfatsu, the agricultural development group, played a critical role and was some sort of a catalyst for these young reform intellectuals. They had an educational background, being self-trained in Marxist classics, but also Maoism during the Cultural Revolution, when they basically formed reading groups and were trying to think about the basic political economic questions in China. In the 1970s, when they returned to the cities and when the universities restarted their entrance exams, they also very quickly read up on a whole range of Western social sciences, trying to basically catch up with social science theory and methods as quickly as they could. They drew their intellectual inspiration, importantly, from the political economy of agriculture, but also from empirical studies in China in the state-owned enterprise sector, and later on also in other countries. So if I'm asking how to create markets in a command economy, I think it's worth quickly illustrating what was at stake with this question, or what the challenges were. So if in a very simple heuristic, which of course is a simple idealized heuristic, and is also kind of operating here on the national level, where of course there were different layers in terms of provinces and so on. But with all these caveats in mind, if we want to very simply summarize the old model, we could say that it was built on the idea of one big national workshop, where basically there were some higher level command authorities that would be commanding outputs and assigning inputs to all the production units, whereas each production unit would have to deliver its output to the next production unit and would in return receive certain inputs that was assigned in order to fulfill the plan. On the surface then, prices here are simply a shadow operation, simply an accounting operation. However, in reality, they also performed a critical role as a mechanism of distribution, since these prices were set in a way that did not necessarily reflect the costs of individual production units or even whole sectors, but were rather set in a political sense with an eye to distribution and development efforts. So the prices of agricultural goods were set artificially low, which resulted in a constant price scissor between the rural sphere and the urban industrial sphere, but also the prices for heavy industry. And you will note that this whole depiction here is only on the urban industrial economy, and I'm happy to comment more on the rural economy in the Q&A. So the heavy industry prices in the urban industrial economy were also set relatively low as a way to encourage more downstream industrialization. At the same time, the prices of downstream non-essential consumer goods were set relatively high in order to extract liquidity from households and thus ensure price stability and basically ensure that there's no excess demand. What happened more or less endogenously as a result of the agricultural reforms was the emergence of a second market track. In many ways, such market tracks already existed during the Maoist period, but they were basically very liminal, marginal occurrences that were more or less suppressed throughout the turbulent years of the Mao period. In the reform era, then, they became much stronger and much more prevalent, since as agricultural households started to produce not only for the plant, but also for the market, they were generating cash incomes, and they were using these cash incomes to buy stuff like wristwatches, bicycles, sewing machines, radios, and so on. But soon also the township and village enterprises emerged, which meant that in the agricultural sphere, there was also a demand for more upstream kind of industrial goods that would be serving as inputs into the township and village enterprises. And furthermore, of course, if the downstream urban industrial sectors were expanding, then they would also have expanding demand for these more upstream industries. So that more or less as a result of a demand pull kind of dynamic, this production for the market beyond the plan was emerging more or less endogenously. So the question then was whether this emergence of markets at the margins under this dual track kind of system was a good thing that should be fostered and systematized and used, or whether it was a bad thing that should be suppressed and some other reform approach should be pursued. In this context, one conference in 1984, the so-called Morgenstern Youth Conference, played an important role, where basically a team of organizers in Beijing summoned young scholars from across China based on an essay competition, where all of these young scholars were invited to submit essays on questions of reform, and then gathered at Morgenstern Mountain for several days discussing questions of economic system reform. It very quickly became clear that price reform was the most pressing and most important question on the table, so that these various groups of scholars started to focus on that question. And after days of debate, they basically settled on a proposal that suggested that the dual track price system should be turned into a formal reform approach and should be turned into national policy. This is in fact also what happened in 1985. And Zhao Ziyang, who was prime minister in the 1980s and was an absolutely critical player in the creation of these new kind of economic policies, then explained to local cadres what this policy would mean. This is from the collected works of Zhao Ziyang. And I find this a useful way to understand what the national government was intending with this policy, since he was trying to explain it to the people who would have to implement this policy. And he was saying that basically this would mean four things: letting go of small commodities. The state should focus on controlling important parts of the economy and not overstretch in trying to control all parts of the economy. It would also mean reforming and adjusting the prices of important goods by improving the price management system and adjusting the prices in small steps so that they would come closer to some notion of cost or value. But fourthly, it also meant participating. Zhan, quote, after having enlivened prices by letting them go, the state had to participate in the market to regulate the prices, as in the first years after liberation. For sectors where prices were allowed to fluctuate on the market, the range of the fluctuations should be limited by market participation. That is to say, the state should have stocks to be able to add supplies to the market when the price was rising too high, and purchase when the price was falling too low. In this context, then, imports could also be used, but only as an emergency balancing mechanism. And in fact, this kind of buffer stock logic of stabilizing the prices of important goods continues to operate until the very day. Just today, one of the headlines that I saw in the economic news on China was that China has released stocks of its egg reserve. Apparently, the Chinese state is running an egg reserve, since the prices for eggs were increasing too fast in the context of general food price pressures. Okay, let me now move to the competing reform camp, which I'm broadly speaking calling the packaged price reformers. The main members of this group were middle-aged established intellectuals who were often trained in orthodox socialist economics in the 1950s and 60s, and then in the 80s were the first to study modern economics in the United States and England. They were joined by young academics, mostly scientists and engineers, who they shared a vision that mathematical models could model the old system and could model a target system for reform and could help to formulate China's path from the old system to the new system. They drew their intellectual inspiration from the socialist calculation debate of the interwar period. In fact, I've also written on this in separate articles. And we're in close exchange with Eastern European immigrant economists, such as the Polish Bruce, Otar Szyk from the Czech Republic, and Kornai, who of course was not an immigrant economist, but someone who was going back and forth between Hungary and Harvard. They also drew inspiration from monetarists such as Milton Friedman and Gregory Chow, and basically the idea of overnight price liberalization as a recipe for instantaneous miraculous success was in this context repeatedly linked or anchored on the idea of an Erhard miracle in West German post-war reform, where Ludwig Erhard allegedly would have instigated the German economic miracle simply by liberalizing oil prices overnight. At least this was the story that Milton Friedman and others were bringing to China. And in fact, in a forthcoming chapter, I'm kind of debunking that story by contrasting it with some of the recent economic history research in German language literature. Okay, when I'm referring to these exchanges with Eastern European immigrant economists, I think it's important to highlight the critical role of the World Bank. The World Bank invited many of these economists to China and facilitated exchanges between Chinese reformers and these economists who used to be reformers in their own context, but by the time had basically given up or emigrated to other places. This is a picture here of the 1982 World Bank Conference on questions of price reform. From the side of the Eastern Europeans, the only person whom I still got to meet in person was a man called Peter Kende, who is the second from the right in the first row, who, when I met him in Paris in a coffee shop in 2017, was wearing the exact same outfit that he's wearing in this picture in 1982, pointing out to me that he had treasured and preserved this outfit since it was such a bold move to go to China and discuss with Chinese officials one of the most critical questions of economic system reform in 1982, at a time when he thought that if he had returned to his native Hungary, he might well have been arrested at the border. I think that this illustrates just how bold not only the Eastern Europeans were who engaged in this dialogue, but also how bold the Chinese were in 1982, that they basically discussed these critical questions with people who were basically considered some sort of dissidents in their home countries. Out of these exchanges, this broad tapestry of trying to catch up with modern mainstream economics, emerged a critique of the dual track system. The argument was that the dual track system would create friction and contradiction, and in fact would amount to a more irrational kind of price system than the pre-reform system. It might have some role to play as a short-run transitional mechanism, but would have to be overcome as quickly as possibly. Important, the dual-track price system would result in inherent rent-seeking and corruption, since the officials running these production units would now face high prices on the market and low prices in the plan, which would immediately give incentives for bribery and corruption. Their recommendation then, broadly speaking, was to adjust prices based on complete models of the economy to basically set up some sort of an equilibrium price vector, impose tight fiscal and monetary policy, and then let go of prices as quickly as possibly. Most importantly, let go of the core prices, the most important, most upstream prices, stuff like energy, steel, and so on. This was then meant to be combined with wage and tax reform, and the market participation by the state should be replaced with indirect macroeconomic policies. However, a critique of this kind of approach to price reform that more or less resembles analytically the idea of a Big Bang emerged within China from the side of the dual-track reformers. They argued that such a Big Bang, that is the liberalization of the most upstream, most important prices, would result in cost-push inflation without adjusting the relative prices and quantities. Since the prices in these upstream industries were in the pre-reform era by design too low, they would more or less, as a necessity, be shooting up. And since all of these production units still faced a soft budget constraint and were not actually market-oriented enterprises, they would simply hand down these large price increases to the next production unit, which eventually would result in a wage price spiral, which could not be contained by macroeconomic control, not only because China didn't have sufficient institutional capacity for macroeconomic control, but also because this kind of process was basically a process of endogenous money creation that would be very hard to suppress with macroeconomic austerity. The core of the debate then was not whether or not to liberalize downstream prices, was not whether or not to let go of so-called small inessential consumer goods, especially the highly profitable sectors that were already in surplus. But the core of the debate was whether or not the state should keep control of the industrial core of the economy and operate a regime of state market participation in a dual track system in these core parts of the industrial economy. In 1986, China came very close to implementing a package price reform that was gradually boiled down, but nevertheless was focused on liberalizing the most important upstream prices. This was ultimately stopped by the intervention of a delegation to Hungary and Yugoslavia that was sending back telegrams warning that this kind of step would result in the kind of cost push inflation that I have just tried to describe to you. In fact, this delegation was interestingly sponsored by George Soros, who's here in the picture on the bottom, meeting with that delegation in 1986. In 1988, Deng Xiaoping himself took initiative towards a radical price reform. By 1988, the social and political tensions that were unleashed through the reform process were mounting to a point where Deng Xiaoping seemed to have found that he needed to somehow push ahead and crash through the barriers that had built up, or as he put it, only once prices have been straightened out will we be able to step up reform. We cannot not carry out price reform. We have to face the risks and difficulties head on. We must not be afraid of risks and be even more courageous. Corruption by then and social inequalities had become a very serious issue, and there was a hope that such a radical price reform could elevate these difficulties. Deng Xiaoping then also adopted more or less the same kind of rhetoric that we can find in pleas for shock therapy more broadly in very different contexts. That is the idea that long-term pain is worse than short-term pain. So in other words, you have to kind of swallow the bitter pill now in order to lay the foundations for future development. In fact, Deng Xiaoping went as far as to say that a lack of price reform impedes China's goal of catching up with Western countries by 2050. On August 18th, the state TV then reported that the Politburo had passed in principle a plan for price and wage reform. And this was happening in a context of already rising prices since the dual track price system had progressed to a point where where more and more also not at all unimportant unimportant commodities were being priced on the market. And the reaction to this announcement of this price reform plan having passed in principle, was in this broad context of enormous tensions enough to basically unleash bank runs and panic buying that were so severe that the Chinese leadership reversed this plan, and then basically in fall of 1988 more or less put reform more generally on hold. Inflation continued for a while, and this tension between a reversal of reform and rising prices, I think, is part of the economic context in which then the large-scale protests in 1989 are occurring. In 1988, Milton Friedman made another appearance in China in the fall of 1988, where he was once more urging for rapid liberalization. But at this point, the window of opportunity had basically closed, and the political dynamic was at a point where basically reform was on ice. So this didn't have much repercussions. In sum, I think we can contrast two competing logics of reform, where the basic logic of shock therapy that I think we can also trace in the Chinese context is one to start from comparative statics and to start from a stylized model of the old system and a theoretically derived target model for the future system, where reform is then being thought of as a shock that enables the transition from the old to the new system. The target system is should be a system that is composed of complete markets, which in this vision can only be achieved by destroying the plan. In contrast, the logic of the dual track system is, I think, to start from an analysis of prevailing economic forces and institutions in order to identify ways to create reform dynamics initially at the margins of the system, then use these unleashed dynamics to re-industrialize the core, hoping that this would work without undermining social stability, which is of course always an extremely delicate balance. Market forces here then are a means in a larger transformation process and need to be unleashed, steered and guided and stabilized by the state rather than being a goal in themselves. In conclusion, then, I would say that China's policy choice was not the Big Bang, but the dual track system, because China's leaders were ultimately not prepared to risk the survival of the communist state and to endanger their vision for long-term development. The Big Bang seemed to promise a scientific solution to economic system reform, but was ultimately found not to create a viable market economy, while being enormously risky, since it was built on undermining the functioning of the core of the plan, such built on undermining the functioning of the backbone of China's industrial economy. The dual track system had more or less gradually emerged as policy alternative, while these more blueprint type approaches were trying to be worked out. The dual track system was created through an experimental reliance on techniques of market creation by the state, always distinguishing between essential and inessential goods and relying on a systematic assessment of the concrete economic conditions and dynamics that prevailed across the different systems and areas of the economy. I think that the fact that the dual track system was in operation was basically what allowed China's leaders not to go for a Big Bang, because however imperfect the dual track system was, and it did create a lot of problems, including corruption, it nevertheless presented an alternative that was already in operation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Very interesting, and I think a very provocative in terms of concepts and in terms of reflection. While we receive some questions and comments and suggestions again through the chat, Isabella, let me pose you two comments and with some questions. No, on the one hand, I don't know if you are aware, you very probably are, and your opinion would be very welcome. The discussion of transitional institutions by Qian Jingyi. I don't know if you know him. He's today in Tsinghua University, and he published widely with Danny Roderick and other institutions. And this discussion that you pose of this dual track system, no, is highly integrated in this discussion on transitional institutions, with the addition that he explicitly discusses the issue of the property in this transition period, no? Which means you can have a transition in terms of incentives, no? But surprisingly, and in terms of results, the property is still in the hand of the public sector. No? From a Latin American perspective, this is very important, because countries such as Latin America have gone massively through liberalization processes, which are a synonym to privatization. This was not the case in China. So I don't know if you're aware of this discussion again on this topic, ¿no?
No, mándamelo por el...
Teresita, si lo pueden apagar, silenciar. Sorry. So discussion of Qian Jingyi more in the 1980s, 1990s. What is your opinion on this? And then, Isabella, as you might imagine, from your perspective, what is the relevance of this dual track system in 2022? No? Is it still alive? Is it relevant? What does it mean in terms of policy options for the current public sector, etc.? Again, two questions before we receive some questions by the chat. No?
Yeah, these are great questions. Thank you very much. On the work of Jiang Xinyi and Danny Roderick in transitional institutions, I would say that this is basically complementary to my work. I think the difference is that my book is basically on the level of ideas, right? I've interviewed all these people that were involved in these debates in the 1980s, and I'm kind of trying to trace the alternative arguments that were at stake in this critical debate, whereas their work, as far as I understand it, is more of an institutional economics kind of approach, trying to distill some of these institutional dynamics, where I'm basically trying to combine institutional economics with intellectual history. On the question of property rights, yes, this is of course incredibly important, and this is basically in some ways an important limitation of my book, since in the 1980s, it's not like there were no discussions around property rights, but they weren't as prevalent yet. So the most pressing question in that context was the question of price reform. And in trying to navigate this incredibly messy kind of primary empirical material that I was collecting, I used price reform as my anchor point and therefore focused on this primarily. However, this is not to say that these two approaches don't also tell us something about property reform, since if you take the example of the dual track system, then this also meant that as these production units started to cater not only to the plant, but also to the market, they were starting to become internally transformed from entities that were basically implementing commands and orders from higher up planning authorities to more and more market-oriented kind of enterprises, which then basically completely changed their logic of operation, and which was in many ways the starting point of the whole debate around questions of property rights reform. And in fact, we're in the 1980s, in the late 1980s in China, first voices emerged that suggested that property rights reform should not simply be a dichotomy between private property and public property, but that China should kind of move beyond this and try to come up with its own innovative institutional arrangements that would break through the dichotomy of private versus public, which is, I think, in many ways linked to this idea of dual track, of combinations of market and plan, of the emergence of new kind of economic governance mechanisms. On your second question of the relevance of the dual track system, I think there are probably kind of three dimensions in which I could emphasize the relevance of the dual track system today. So first of all, I think that for China's reindustrialization process in the 90s and 2000s, it was very important that the backbone of the industrial system that was created during the Maoist period, with all the faults of the Maoist development model, China had made some breakthroughs, important breakthroughs in the development of heavy industry and the building up of a basic industrial foundation. Not giving up on this, not risking that part, I think was an important foundation for the development in the subsequent decades. So from that perspective, this dual track system that basically preserved the core and transformed the core, but without giving up on it, without giving up on the ambition of having these industries within China under the stewardship of the state, I think was an important foundation of China's economic rights, which in many ways is the tension that we are facing now, right, in between the US and China. Secondly, I think from an institutional perspective, of course, the dual track system is now no longer like a universal kind of system, far from it. It basically still exists in some of the most important upstream industries, stuff like electricity. But it was the starting point of these decades of institutional reform. So if you take the example of the electricity sector and the ways in which the electricity sector was being rebuilt, then this was a very careful, cautious kind of process, moving from a planned electricity sector under one ministry into a more corporate kind of structure, then several pretty radical experiments in the early 2000s, which were then stopped. And then basically this institutional rebuilding process has continued all the way until today in many ways. I mean, the whole like coal shortages and electricity shortages in fall last year are in some sense the latest iteration in this like institutional fine tuning of both the corporate and property side, but also the price design side of the story. So in that sense, the institutional arrangements in the commanding heights of China's economy are of course no longer what they were in the 1980s, but the path very much links to this initial setup, to this dynamic, to this logic that is being established in the 80s. And then thirdly, I mean, one of the most pressing economic policy questions of the day, I suppose, at least in the OECD. I know in Latin America, this is probably more of an evergreen, but the US and Europe suddenly wakes up to the problem of inflation after no one has thought about this outside the context of development economics for years and years and years. Whereas in the Chinese context, we see that we basically have an approach to price stabilization that does not exclusively rely on macroeconomic stabilization through the central bank or through fiscal policy, but that also relies on what I have been calling state market participation for important kinds of consumer and producer goods. We could see this in 2021 when the price for certain metals was shooting up, and basically there was a very coordinated effort to increase the supply of these metals by encouraging state-owned enterprises to release some of their inventories and not hoard these kind of metals, but also by releasing national reserves. And we can see this again as we speak in the context of the inflationary pressures from a cost push perspective that are emerging in the global economy in the context of the war with Ukraine and all the turmoil of the pandemic that we have all been talking about. So in that context, then I think China really has an institutional setup that allows it to do price stabilization in ways that is quite drastically different and that could prove to be fairly critical in the current context.
Great, very interesting. I don't know if you can follow the chat. Usually we have a very active fellowship. Today we are very shy. But again, there are two questions so far, one by Jorge Ivan Puma. I don't know if you can read it, regarding this dual track group. No, what did they read? among other things. And then a second by Professor Bruno Gandelgruber, no?
Yeah, so I think they were really incredibly eclectic in their reading. Many of them during the Cultural Revolution, when they were still like part of these kind of informal student type reading groups, were certainly also reading texts that were related to the new economic policy in Russia in the 1920s, and questions of other forms of socialist organizations in that context. In the late 70s, it's really, there are translation efforts that are incredibly far-ranging, from Tychett Parsons to cybernetics. So you have really like this very, very broad engagement with a whole range of social science theories and methods, where basically we have to remember that during the Cultural Revolution, economics as a discipline had been more or less on hold, and the social science access to Western knowledge was also very, very limited. So this was really like a very major catch-up exercise. They were also studying increasingly quote unquote modern economics, and started to adopt the language of modern economics, and replaced the terminology of Marxist economics with the terminology of microeconomics and macroeconomics and price elasticities and all of that. So in that sense, they did start to engage with neoclassical economics in particular. However, this was always combined with this very inductive approach of going out and doing field research, initially in the agricultural experiments, and later on also very large-scale research survey exercises in the state-owned enterprises, trying to understand what the state of reform was and what kind of initiatives were emerging spontaneously out of this political opening that happened in the 1980s. So that it was not like there were like 5 texts that they read, and then they basically drew their ideas based on that, and then they implemented them, and then that's the story. But it's rather this like very eclectic search across a whole range of different literatures, combined and always rooted in these like kind of inductive survey research type of exercises.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question, Isabella, by Professor Gandelgruber. Thank you very much. And 2 questions related to the administrative and statistical functioning of the dual track system that you highlight, no? Did the Chinese government maintain some kind of national production plan? And how did this affect the national accounting system in terms of GDP and growth statistics? Thank you very much, Bruno.
Yeah, that's a great question. We have to remember that by the beginning of reform, China's statistical capacity was actually very, very limited, again, because of the Cultural Revolution and what that had meant for the statistics. The institutions that were actually collecting statistics and systematically using them and so on, right? So in many ways, the statistical apparatus was being rebuilt through the reform period. There is a shift in accounting that is occurring. I'm not an expert on that, and I should not pretend I am. I know that basically, there is a lot of price statistics available for the 80s, and they were collected at all sorts of different kinds of levels, and there were very major price research institutes that also started with these statistical, really like empirical data gathering kind of exercises. There were also the first input-output tables constructed and so on. As regards the plan, the plan continued in the 80s, of course, but there was increasingly a shift then in the 1990s from this like straight out direct planning based on some sort of a command economy towards more and more indicative planning, which came about as a result of the marketization of the economy. In this context, then the macroeconomic governance, of course, also became increasingly important. But it's, I think, important to see that it did not completely replace China's economic governance mechanisms, but that beyond the surface of macroeconomic governance, planning mechanisms and state market participation type of mechanisms continued.
Thank you, Isabella. And the last question by Ambassador Eugenio Anguiano, who was ambassador in those times and from Mexico and China, and asks what would be the impact of this double track approach in liberating or in the liberalization of prices in the 1989 political crisis. Is there some kind of link in your analysis and opinion?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So basically, what happened through the dual track system is that certain things that had very high market prices also became incredibly profitable. So you could have a situation where people who were basically within the first track, let's say high school teachers or university professors who were basically still receiving their salaries based on the planned type of standards, suddenly were making less money than the guy who's selling eggs in the streets or pancakes or whatever it may be. So that you get this like very rapid reshuffling of distribution and these like very erratic kind of ways, which I think was an important part of the social tensions that were built up in the 80s. And then of course, as inflation became a problem, those that basically had fixed kind of wage incomes did not see their incomes adjust as rapidly as those that had market incomes. So this then exacerbated these kind of inequalities. The problem of corruption, of course, also added to the impression of an unjust kind of system and a very unjust kind of transition. So I think these are some of the points where these dynamics were connected and were part of. I'm not saying that 89 was simply an economic kind of outcome of inflation, but I think that this kind of economic dynamic fueled the political dynamic that was already in the making.
Thank you, Isabella. Look, I think we are pretty much done in terms of questions. I would have one last issue. I think one of the great contributions among many others is the issue of your book, is the issue of the importance of the World Bank in this reform and opening up process. And if I understand correctly, also the incidence in this dual track system of the World Bank. No, so in your opinion, more recently, it doesn't have to be in 2022, but how is the relationship between more recently between the Chinese government and the World Bank, considering also difficulties? I remind you the harsh discussions and disruptions between the Development Research Center in 2012 and this big book, no, with the World Bank that got erased from web pages, etc., and you can still find it, etc. In your opinion, how is the relationship today after this strong impact of the World Bank in China in the 1980s and 1990s? No?
Yeah, so I'm really not an expert on the World Bank's recent engagement in China, since I interviewed all the people who were there in the 80s and so on, but this doesn't give me any privileged expertise on the more recent developments. I just want to put this caveat. I think generally speaking, we can say that the relationship between the World Bank and China was very different compared to the relationship between the World Bank and other developing countries. For broadly speaking, I think two reasons. One is that China never became in a substantial way dependent on World Bank loans, right? I mean, it's not like they didn't take out loans, but they never became indebted in a way where any kind of conditionalities and so on could really have been employed. So in that sense, from the Chinese perspective, the World Bank has always been more of a source of economic expertise that the Chinese government was trying to draw on. And of course, also credits that came in useful. I'm not saying this didn't matter, but it didn't matter. I mean, it wasn't existential to the Chinese system whether they had these World Bank loans or not. So in that sense, the relationship has, I think, been quite different compared to the relationship in other contexts. The related second point that I'd like to make is that, of course, the economic policy discourse today is by far no longer as open as it was in the 1980s, because in the 80s you have this kind of period where it's really not entirely clear what the future will look like, and China is very seriously engaging with a very wide range of possibilities. Nevertheless, I think this principle of consulting a very wide range of sources of expertise in important economic policy decisions to some extent continues, where you can have a study by McKinsey and a study from the Central Party School being solicited on the same kind of topic, right? So in that same context, then the World Bank is one player amongst many, rather than the one and only authoritative source within the Chinese system.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabella. Again, I hope we can continue having this dialogue. Again, as you might imagine, this topic of structural reforms and shock therapies is very important in Latin America. No, since the 1980s, Latin America have gone, and until today, we have a long history of shock therapies, and the comparison with China is very relevant. No, so thank you very much. Congratulations again on your book, and I sincerely hope we can continue in this dialogue. No?
Thank you very much for having me. I hope there will be a chance to learn more from the Latin American perspective on these questions of shock therapy and how it played out in China. I would be very interested to learn from everybody's insights and views on that. Thank you.
We hope you can visit us sometime in person when the health situation allows it to. No?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we don't want to take more of your time, and thank you very much. No, have a great time, and we will continue writing each other.
Thank you. It was a very good
Bye-bye.
presentation. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Eugenio, Bruno. Thank you.
Bye.